at February 18, 1945.
Private First Class. Frank Novak is alone in a frozen crater outside Prüm, Germany. His rifle is jammed. His ammunition belt is empty. Every American position within 2 miles has withdrawn hours ago.
And he's surrounded by 19 German scouts. In the next 4 hours, Frank Novak will kill every single one of them. Not with bullets, not with grenades. With a combat knife, a sharpened shovel, and the butchering techniques he learned at age 14 in the slaughterhouses of Chicago's South Side. When dawn breaks over the Eifel Mountains, German officers will find their elite reconnaissance team scattered across 300 yards of frozen ground. 19 bodies, each killed in brutal, efficient silence. The Americans will discover Novak sitting against a tree, smoking a cigarette he took from a dead German lieutenant, his hands black with dried blood. This is the story of the most lopsided hand-to-hand combat engagement of World War II. And it starts not in the forests of Germany, but in the blood-soaked killing floors of the Chicago stockyards. Frank Novak grew up on South Halsted Street in Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood, where the Union stockyards processed 40,000 cattle every single week. The smell of blood was so thick in the air that residents 3 miles away could taste iron on their tongues. His father worked the killing floor at Swift & Company, a brutal job that broke most men within 5 years. Frank started there at 14, lying about his age, carrying blood buckets, and learning to sharpen knives on leather strops until the edges could split a hair. But Frank was different. By 16, he was working the cutting line. The foreman noticed his hands immediately, fast, precise, no wasted motion whatsoever. He could break down a side of beef in 11 minutes flat. Other workers needed 17. Frank understood anatomy, the way mechanics understand engines. He knew where joints separated, where tendons connected, how much pressure bone could take before it shattered. He knew that if you cut the carotid artery at a 45-degree angle, death came in 8 seconds. Cut it straight across? 12 seconds. These weren't abstract facts. This was his daily reality. The stockyards taught violence as routine. Not emotional, not personal, just efficient. You grabbed the hook. You made the cut. You moved to the next one. The smell of blood became ordinary. The sound of things dying became background noise. Frank's supervisor, a German immigrant named Klaus Becker, once told him, "You have a gift, boy. You see death as a technical problem. That's rare. Most men need to hate the animal first. You just need to understand it." Frank didn't know it then, but Klaus was training him for something far more terrible than cattle. Frank joined the Army in March 1943, 3 months after his 18th birthday. The recruiter asked if he had any special skills. "I'm good with knives," Frank said. The recruiter wrote "butcher" on the form and smiled. Army can always use a man who knows how to cut meat. By December 1944, Frank was in Belgium with the 28th Infantry Division. He didn't talk much. The other soldiers thought he was slow, quiet, maybe even scared. They were wrong. Frank was watching, observing, learning how men moved when they fought, where they protected themselves, where they left themselves exposed. His platoon sergeant, a tobacco farmer from Tennessee named Roy Hutchins, noticed Frank's hands during bayonet drill. "You'd done this before," Hutchins said. Frank nodded. "Cattle, mostly." Hutchins studied him for a long moment, then assigned him to point position during night patrols. "You see in the dark better than most," Hutchins said. Frank knew why. The stockyards ran night shifts. You learned to work by moonlight and lamplight, to see shapes in shadow, to identify threats before they materialized. But by February 1945, Frank was watching his friends die because of a broken system. The problem was simple. American security patrols were following a doctrine that was getting them slaughtered. Here's how it worked. Small infantry squads would rotate through forward positions every 4 hours, maintaining perimeter security, preventing German infiltration. If they encountered enemy forces, the doctrine was crystal clear: radio for support, hold position, wait for reinforcement. On paper, it made perfect sense. In reality, it was a death sentence. The Germans had superior radio direction, finding equipment. Every call for support became a beacon, a target, a funeral announcement. On January 29, Corporal Eddie Breslin's squad encountered German scouts 2 miles east of Pronsfeld. Breslin followed protocol. He radioed for support. The Germans triangulated his position in 90 seconds and hit the squad with mortar fire. 5 Americans died before the first reinforcement arrived. Breslin took shrapnel through his throat. He drowned in his own blood while 2 riflemen held him, unable to help, unable to stop the flood of red pouring from his neck. Frank had known Breslin since training. They'd shared a tent at Camp Atterbury. Breslin collected postcards. 47 postcards from cities he'd never visited. Frank watched Sergeant Hutchins' inventory, Breslin's effects after the body came back. The postcards were soaked through with blood, the handwritten messages on the back completely illegible. On February 3rd, Private Raymond Keller's patrol encountered German scouts near Gondenbrett. Keller called for support. German snipers killed Keller and 2 others before reinforcements arrived. Frank saw Keller's body when they recovered it the next morning. Single shot through the left eye. The German sniper had been less than 200 yards away, close enough to see Keller's face when he pulled the trigger. On February 9, Sergeant William Davenport's squad got hit by a German reconnaissance unit near Fleringen. Davenport followed doctrine. He called for help. The Germans heard the radio transmission and flanked the American position while Davenport waited for reinforcement. 4 Americans died in the first 30 seconds. Davenport took a bayonet through his stomach. He lived for 6 hours, bleeding internally, his intestines perforated in 17 places. Frank sat with him in the aid station. Davenport kept apologizing, his voice weak and raspy. "I did what they told me," Davenport whispered. "I followed the manual. Why am I dying, Frank? I did everything right." Frank held Davenport's hand until the morphine finally took him. He didn't have an answer. Or rather, he had the answer, but it was too brutal to speak out loud. "The manual is wrong. The doctrine is killing us." The statistics were undeniable. American security patrols in the Eifel Mountains suffered a 38% casualty rate during the first 2 weeks of February. Battalion headquarters attributed losses to aggressive enemy reconnaissance and difficult terrain. But the real problem was simpler and more infuriating. Following orders was getting good men killed. Frank sat in his foxhole that night and thought about the stockyards. You didn't call for help when a steer broke loose on the killing floor. You handled it. You used the tools available. You moved fast and finished the job before it became a bigger problem. The next morning, Frank found Hutchins in the command post. "Radio's getting us killed," Frank said. Hutchins nodded slowly. "I know. So why do we use it?" "Because those are the orders. We establish contact. We report. We withdraw. That's doctrine. Doctrine's not working." Hutchins lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "You got a better idea?" Frank thought about Klaus Becker, his old supervisor at the stockyards. "You see death as a technical problem." "What if we didn't call for help?" Frank said. "You mean engage German scouts without support?" "I mean handle it before it becomes something we need support for." Hutchins studied him carefully. "You're talking about silent work, close quarters, knife work, that kind of thing." "Yeah. You ever done that to a man?" "No," Frank admitted, "but I've done it to thousands of cattle." Hutchins laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "Cattle don't fight back, son." "Germans do," Frank said, "but if you're fast enough, they don't fight long." Hutchins crushed out his cigarette. "You volunteer for next patrol rotation. I won't stop you. But you try that silent work and get yourself killed, that's on you. Battalion won't approve it. Company commander won't acknowledge it. You'll just be another casualty statistic. Frank nodded. I know. You really think you can take on German scouts alone? Frank thought about the cutting line at Swift and Company. 40,000 cattle a week. 11 minutes per animal. No hesitation. No wasted motion. I think I can kill them before they know I'm there. That's not the same thing as surviving. It's close enough.
February 17th, 1945, 10:15 p.m.
Frank was in the small Nissen hut barracks, trying to read a tattered copy of a detective novel when Technical Sergeant Frank Russo came to him. Russo was 21 years old, pale, skinny, with hands that shook when he wasn't paying attention. He was scheduled to fly his first deep penetration mission the next morning, the same type of mission that had killed Breslin, Keller, and Davenport. He was sweating despite the cold night air. Sergeant Novak, Russo's voice was barely a whisper. I heard what happened to Finch. I looked at the protocols. I read the manual. If I follow doctrine and call for help, the Germans will kill me before support arrives. But if I don't call for help, I'm disobeying orders. Russo's eyes were wide, terrified, the eyes of a kid who just realized he was being sent to die because of bureaucratic incompetence. I don't know what to do, Russo continued. I don't want to die because I followed the rules, but I don't want to die because I broke them either. Frank closed his book. He looked at Russo, really looked at him. This kid was maybe 19, lying about being 21. He probably had a girl back home, probably had parents who still thought their boy was safe, doing his duty, following orders. Please, Sergeant, Russo said. Everyone says you know how to survive out there. Everyone says you're different. Tell me what to do. I don't want to freeze up out there. I don't want to die. Frank thought about Eddie Breslin drowning in his own blood, Raymond Keller shot through the eye, William Davenport bleeding out for 6 hours, apologizing for following orders. The moral calculus was brutally simple. Follow doctrine and watch more kids die, or break the rules and give them a fighting chance. Frank made his decision. Listen carefully, Frank said. Tomorrow night, I'm going out on patrol. I'm going to show you and everyone else that there's another way, a way that doesn't get us all killed. What way? Silent. Fast. Before the Germans know we're there. Russo looked confused. You mean? Nonder, hand to hand. I mean, whatever it takes to survive. Frank spent the next day preparing like a surgeon, preparing for a complex operation. He started with his primary knife, the Army issue, M3 trench knife. 6.9-inch blade, carbon steel, double-edged. It was designed for fighting, not utility work. Frank tested the edge against his thumbnail, not sharp enough. He found a whetstone in the supply tent and worked the blade for 90 minutes. The edge became razor-fine, sharp enough to shave the hair off his forearm. At the stockyards, Klaus Becker had taught him that a dull knife was more dangerous than no knife at all. A dull blade tears, Klaus used to say. A sharp blade cuts clean. Clean cuts mean faster death. Faster death means less suffering. Less suffering means you can do your job without hesitation. Frank wasn't interested in minimizing suffering for the Germans, but he was interested in speed and efficiency. Then he studied the knife's balance. The M3 was too handle-heavy, designed for stabbing rather than slashing. At the stockyards, Frank had used custom knives, blades balanced for precise cuts, handles shaped for extended work. He wrapped the M3's handle with medical tape, adding thickness, improving grip. Better. But one knife wouldn't be enough. German scouts operated in teams. They spread out. Taking them down would require multiple kills in rapid sequence. If his primary weapon failed or got stuck in bone, he needed backup. Frank requisitioned a second knife from supply. The quartermaster, a tired corporal from Ohio, barely looked at him. Lost mine on patrol, Frank lied. The quartermaster handed him a replacement without checking records. Frank now had 2 knives, one strapped to his belt, one secured inside his boot, handle down, easily accessible. But knives had limitations. They required close contact. German scouts carried rifles with effective ranges of 400 yards. They'd shoot him before he got within knife range. He needed something with reach, something quiet, something that could incapacitate instantly. Frank walked to the engineering supply dump and found an entrenching tool, the standard folding shovel every infantryman carried for digging foxholes. He examined it carefully. 2-pound steel blade, 16-inch wooden handle. The blade was dull from months of digging frozen ground. Frank spent 2 hours sharpening it on the whetstone until the edge could split paper. The edge wouldn't hold long under combat conditions, but it would be enough for a few critical strikes. He tested the weight, swinging it like a hatchet. The balance was perfect. At the stockyards, Frank had used captive bolt guns to stun cattle before slaughter. A single strike to the head, immediate incapacitation, followed by knife work to finish the job. The entrenching tool would work the same way. That night, Frank lay in his foxhole and visualized the encounter like a chess master visualizing a complex endgame. German scouts would spread out in the darkness. Standard Wehrmacht reconnaissance doctrine used 8 to 20-man teams with 5 to 10-yard spacing. That meant potential sightlines between team members. Killing one scout would alert the others, unless Frank worked faster than they could react. At the stockyards, speed was everything. The cattle moved down the line in a continuous flow. You made your cut. You moved to the next one. No hesitation, no wasted motion. The fastest workers could process 17 cattle per hour. Frank calculated timing. A running man covered 50 yards in roughly 8 seconds. A skilled knife fighter could kill in 2 seconds. 1 second to close the distance, 1 second to make the cut. That left 6 seconds before the next scout noticed. Not enough time. Frank would need to close the distance without running. He'd need to stay low, move through shadow, exploit terrain. He thought about terrain and psychology. The Eifel Mountains were heavily forested. The tree line provided cover. The ground was frozen, which meant footsteps made noise on snow but stayed silent on bare earth. German scouts would avoid open areas. They'd move through trees, following natural cover. That's where Frank would hunt them. But waiting wasn't enough. He needed to control the engagement. He needed to isolate scouts, separate them from their team, take them down one at a time. At the stockyards, Frank had learned to herd cattle, use pressure and position to move them where you wanted them. Men weren't cattle, but they followed similar patterns. Make noise in one direction, they'd look that direction. Create movement in their peripheral vision, they'd investigate. Frank could use himself as bait, not obvious bait, subtle movements. A silhouette that appeared and disappeared. The suggestion of threat, not the confirmation. German scouts would investigate. When they did, Frank would be waiting. February 18, 8:30 p.m. Company Commander Captain Mitchell assembled the platoon for evening briefing. His face was drawn, exhausted. They'd lost 11 men in the past week. New orders from battalion, Mitchell said. We need to increase patrol frequency. German scouts are calling in accurate artillery fire on our positions. Intelligence needs prisoner interrogation. Someone has to bring back a live German for questioning. Mitchell's eyes swept across the assembled soldiers and stopped on Frank. Novak, you're on point for tonight's patrol. Take 5 men. Establish listening post at grid reference. Echo 7. 4-hour rotation. Capture or eliminate any German scouts you encounter. Frank looked at Sergeant Hutchins. Hutchins gave a barely perceptible nod. Mitchell had read Frank's personnel file. He knew about the stockyards. He was giving Frank permission to try his unorthodox approach. Any questions? Mitchell asked. No one spoke. Good. Move out at 20:30 hours. Dismissed. That afternoon, Frank sat alone in a supply tent and ran through his mental checklist one final time. 2 knives, freshly sharpened. Entrenching tool, razor-edged. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. At the stockyards, Klaus Becker used to say, "The moment you hesitate is the moment you fail." Decide what needs to be done, then do it without thinking. Thinking creates doubt. Doubt creates hesitation. Hesitation creates suffering. Frank didn't plan to hesitate. Frank's patrol assembled at the company perimeter at 8:03 p.m. 6 men total, including Frank. All of them were replacements except Frank, fresh soldiers from the February reinforcement pool, most with less than 2 weeks combat experience. Perfect. They'd follow orders without questioning. Frank briefed them in the supply tent, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "We're setting up a listening post at Echo 7. German scouts operate in this sector. Battalion wants prisoners. We're going to get them." One of the replacements, a rifleman from Ohio named Garrett, raised his hand. "What's the engagement protocol, Sergeant?" "Silent," Frank said. "No gunfire unless absolutely necessary. We use radios only if we encounter forces we can't handle." "Define forces we can't handle," Garrett said. "Armor, artillery, anything with more than 20 men." Garrett looked confused. "What if we encounter a German patrol? We handle it. Without radio support?" "Without radio support." The replacements exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a corporal from Michigan named Sullivan, spoke up carefully. "Sarge, we're supposed to call for reinforcement if we make contact. That's in the manual." "New rules," Frank said flatly. "Radio silence unless I authorize transmission. Questions?" Sullivan opened his mouth, then closed it. No one else spoke. Frank distributed equipment. Each man carried standard infantry load: M1 rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations. Frank carried his rifle but left most of his ammunition belt behind. He took only 2 magazines, 16 rounds total. He secured his 2 knives and his sharpened entrenching tool. Sullivan noticed immediately. "Novak, where's your ammunition?" "Don't need it. What if we get hit?" "We won't." "How do you know?" Frank looked at him with the same calm expression he'd worn on the killing floor at Swift & Company. "Because we're not making noise. We're not calling for help. We're not giving the Germans anything to find." They moved out at 8:30 p.m. The night was cold and clear, temperature around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Quarter moon provided minimal light. The terrain was mixed forest and open ground, rolling hills with scattered vegetation. The patrol moved in standard formation, Frank on point, 2 men flanking, 3 in rear security. They reached grid reference Echo 7 at 9:45 p.m. The position was a small ridge overlooking a valley, good sight lines, multiple escape routes, natural cover. Frank positioned the patrol in a defensive semicircle and settled in to wait. Nothing happened for 2 hours. Then, at 11:47 p.m., Frank spotted movement 800 yards northeast. Multiple silhouettes moving through the tree line, using terrain for cover, maintaining tactical spacing. German patrol. Frank counted heads carefully. 19 men, full reconnaissance team. He had 2 options: radio for support and watch the Germans scatter, or engage them directly and risk annihilation. Frank chose the third option. He would hunt them. Frank signaled Sullivan with hand signs. "Enemy patrol. 19 men. Northeast sector. Hold position. Maintain silence." Sullivan's eyes went wide with shock and fear. 19 Germans. 6 Americans. That was suicide by any reasonable tactical standard. Sullivan reached for his radio handset. Frank grabbed Sullivan's wrist and shook his head firmly. "No radio." Sullivan whispered urgently, "We need support." Frank whispered back, "They'll hear the transmission. They'll kill us before support arrives." "Then what do we do?" Frank pointed at himself. "I'll handle it." Sullivan stared at him in disbelief. "You're going out there? Alone? Against 19 Germans?" Frank nodded once. "That's insane. That's the mission." Sullivan released his radio handset slowly. "If you die out there, I'm calling for support. If I die, you withdraw immediately. Get the patrol back to American lines. Tell Hutchins what happened. And if you don't die? Frank checked his knives one final time, testing the edges with his thumb. Both were razor sharp. Then you won't hear any Germans. Frank moved into the tree line at 11:53 p.m. He left his rifle with Sullivan, too loud, too cumbersome for the work ahead. He carried his two knives, the sharpened entrenching tool, and nothing else. The weight felt perfect, balanced. He could move fast. The German patrol was 600 yards away, still moving southwest toward American lines. Frank paralleled their route, staying 50 yards east, using trees for cover. The forest floor was a treacherous mix of snow patches and frozen earth. Frank stepped carefully, testing each footfall before committing his weight. A single snapped branch, a single crunch of snow, and the entire operation would fail. Silence was survival. The Germans were maintaining standard Wehrmacht reconnaissance formation, 3-man point element, 12-man main body, 4-man rear guard. The main body clustered tight, roughly 5-yard intervals. The point element ranged ahead by 30 yards. The rear guard lagged behind by 20. Perfect. Frank identified his first target, rear guard, eastern flank. A solitary scout, 30 yards behind the main body, watching the right side while his team watched forward. Alone, isolated, vulnerable. Frank closed the distance with the patience of a predator. 40 yards. 30. 20. The scout was young, maybe 19 years old, with a Mauser rifle slung over his shoulder and binoculars in his cold hands. He was scanning the western tree line carefully. He wasn't watching east. Fatal mistake. Frank moved through shadow like smoke. 10 yards. 5. He could hear the German breathing, could see the fog of his breath in the moonlight, could smell the tobacco on his uniform. 2 yards. The German turned. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the German to register surprise, but not long enough to scream. Frank drove the entrenching tool into the scout's skull with surgical precision. The sharpened blade cut through the steel helmet and bone with a wet, horrific crack. The German's eyes rolled back instantly. His knees buckled. Frank caught him as he fell, lowering him silently to the frozen ground. No noise. No scream. Just the quiet sound of a body settling into snow. Frank pulled his knife and cut the German's throat in a single smooth motion, the same motion he'd performed 10,000 times on the killing floor at Swift and Company. The carotid artery sprayed bright red in the moonlight. Frank stepped aside to avoid the blood pattern. He wiped his blade clean on the German's coat and moved toward the next target. 1 down. 18 to go. The rear guard's western flank scout was 40 yards ahead, still watching forward, completely unaware that his teammate was dead 30 yards behind him. Frank closed the distance. 30 yards. 20. 10. This time, Frank used the knife first. He came up behind the scout and clamped his left hand over the German's mouth, yanking his head back violently. The knife in his right hand went into the neck below the ear, angled sharply upward into the brainstem. The German convulsed once, a single, involuntary spasm, and went completely limp. Frank lowered him to the ground gently, almost respectfully. 2 down. 17 to go. The rear guard's center scout was 50 yards ahead. He'd stopped to light a cigarette, cupping his hands around the match to hide the flame. For 3 seconds his face was illuminated, young, scared, far from home. He was 19 years old and 3 miles inside American-held territory, and some part of him knew he might die tonight. He was right. Frank moved through the darkness like a ghost. 40 yards. 30. The German extinguished his cigarette and resumed walking, trying to close the gap with the main body. Frank paralleled him, matching his pace exactly, staying just inside the tree line. 20 yards. 15. The German stopped suddenly, turned. looked directly at Frank's position. Frank froze, becoming perfectly still. In the darkness, a motionless human is almost invisible. Movement is what catches the eye. The German squinted, staring into the shadows. He raised his rifle slowly. Frank threw the knife. The blade rotated once through the cold air and caught the German in the throat. The scout grabbed at it instinctively, trying to pull it free. Blood poured through his fingers. He opened his mouth to scream. No sound came out, just horrible gurgling as his severed windpipe filled with blood. He fell to his knees. Frank closed the distance and drove his second knife into the German's temple. The scout collapsed sideways into the snow. Frank retrieved both knives, wiping them clean. 3 down. 16 to go. Frank moved toward the main body. The remaining rearguard scout was 25 yards away, still completely unaware that 3 of his teammates were dead. Frank killed him with the entrenching tool, a single strike to the base of the skull. The German went down hard. Frank dragged the body into the tree line and moved forward quickly. 4 down, 15 to go. The main body had stopped in a small clearing ahead. 12 men gathered in a loose circle, conferring over a map. Their voices carried faintly through the cold air. German words Frank didn't understand, but the tone was clear. They were arguing about grid references, pointing in different directions. Their rifles were slung casually. Their attention was divided. They felt safe, protected by their numbers, confident in their training and equipment. They were wrong. Frank circled east, moving through heavy brush with agonizing slowness. Every step was calculated. Every movement was deliberate. The Germans were focused on their map, debating their next move. Frank selected his next target carefully, eastern flank security, 15 yards from the main group, watching the tree line. Alone. Distracted. Perfect. Frank closed the distance. 20 yards. 15. 10. The scout turned at the last second, some combat instinct screaming danger. Too late. Frank hit him with the entrenching tool. The blade caught the German in the face, splitting his nose and crushing his orbital socket. Blood exploded across the snow. The German fell backward, still alive, trying to scream. Frank followed him down and drove his knife into the sternum, angling upward toward the heart. The blade punched through muscle and cartilage. The German shuddered violently and died. 5 down, 14 to go. The noise attracted attention. One of the Germans in the main body looked toward Frank's position. He saw his fallen comrade. His eyes went wide. He shouted in German, a sharp, urgent warning. The remaining 13 Germans grabbed their rifles and spun toward the threat. Time slowed down. Frank had approximately 3 seconds before they opened fire. 3 seconds to decide, retreat into the forest, and let them escape, or charge directly into the center of 14 armed men. At the stockyards, Klaus Becker used to say, "The moment you commit, you can't hesitate. Forward or backward, but never frozen. Frozen means dead." Frank charged. He crashed through the brush at full sprint, closing on the main body before they could organize a coherent defense. The Germans were scrambling, trying to form firing positions, shouting orders in panicked German. The first German raised his Mauser rifle. Frank threw the entrenching tool. It spun through the air end over end and caught the German square in the chest with devastating force. Ribs cracked. The German went down hard. 6 down, 13 to go. Frank pulled his second knife and hit the defensive line like a hurricane. The nearest German swung his rifle butt. Frank ducked under it and slashed across the German's throat. The carotid artery opened. Arterial spray painted the snow red. The German dropped. 7 down, 12 to go. Another German fired. The muzzle flash was blinding in the darkness. The bullet missed Frank by inches. He felt the pressure wave as it passed his head. Frank closed the distance in 2 strides and stabbed the shooter in the gut. The blade punched through layers of winter uniform and into soft tissue. The German doubled over, screaming. Frank finished him with a slash across the neck. 8 down, 11 to go. The remaining Germans were breaking now, their discipline collapsing under the psychological horror of close-quarters combat. Training prepared you for firefights, for artillery, for long-range engagements. Nothing prepared you for a man with a knife killing your friends 2 feet away. 5 Germans turned and ran into the forest, fleeing southwest toward American lines. Frank couldn't let them escape. They'd alert the Wehrmacht. More German patrols would come. The element of surprise would be lost forever. He chased them into the darkness. The fleeing Germans were spread out, panicked, running without formation or coordination. Survival instinct had completely overridden their training. Frank caught the slowest one 50 yards into the trees. He grabbed the German's collar and yanked him backward with brutal force. The German fell hard. Frank knelt on his chest and cut his throat. 9 down, 10 to go. The next German was faster, younger, more athletic. He was sprinting through the forest like a deer, jumping fallen logs, dodging trees. Frank chased him for 200 yards through the freezing darkness. The German's lungs were giving out. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was slowing down, his legs burning with lactic acid. Frank closed the gap and tackled him from behind. They rolled through the snow, grappling desperately. The German pulled a knife. Frank blocked the thrust and headbutted him in the face. The German's nose shattered with a wet crunch. Frank stabbed him in the throat. The German's struggles stopped immediately. 10 down, 9 to go. The remaining 9 Germans had split into 2 groups. 3 were heading southwest toward American lines. 6 were moving northwest, trying to circle back toward German-held territory. Frank went after the smaller group first, 3 Germans running in loose formation, staying close together for psychological comfort. He caught them in a ravine. The first German heard Frank coming and turned to fight. He swung his rifle like a club. Frank ducked and drove his knife up under the German's rib cage. The blade punched through the diaphragm into the lung. The German gasped, blood frothing from his mouth. He died standing up. 11 down, 8 to go. The second German fired his rifle. The shot went wide, the bullet whining off into the forest. Frank closed the distance before the German could work the bolt action. Frank tackled him. They hit the ground hard. The German tried to gouge Frank's eyes. Frank caught his wrist, twisted violently, and felt bones snap. The German screamed. Frank silenced him with a knife to the heart. 12 down, 7 to go. The third German was cornered against a rocky outcrop, trapped with nowhere to run. He raised his hands in surrender, his face pale with terror. Bitte, the German whispered. Bitte nicht töten. Please, please don't kill. Frank hesitated for a fraction of a second. This German was maybe 18 years old, unarmed, terrified, surrendering. This was the prisoner battalion wanted for interrogation. But the other 6 Germans were getting away. And if this scout started screaming, they'd hear him. The operation would be compromised. Frank thought about Eddie Breslin drowning in his own blood. Raymond Keller shot through the eye. William Davenport bleeding out for 6 hours. The German in front of him wasn't responsible for those deaths, but his Wehrmacht comrades were. And this was war. Frank made the cut. Fast, clinical, professional. The scout died without making a sound. 13 down. The final? 638, 40, 1,000. The remaining 6 Germans had scattered northwest, trying to reach German lines. Frank tracked them through the frozen forest, his breath coming in controlled bursts, his hands still steady despite the carnage behind him. He found 2 of them together, moving through a creek bed, using the frozen water to mask their footprints. They were whispering urgently in German, checking their compass, trying to navigate in the darkness. Frank came at them from above, sliding down the embankment in complete silence. The first German never saw him coming. Frank used the entrenching tool, 1 strike to the back of the head. The German collapsed into the frozen creek. 14 down. 5 to go. The second German spun around, grabbing for his rifle. Frank was faster. He drove his knife into the German's stomach, then up under the rib cage. The blade found the heart. The German's eyes went wide with shock, then empty. 15 down. 4 to go. Frank found the next German hiding behind a fallen oak tree, trembling violently, his rifle forgotten in the snow beside him. The scout was crying, tears freezing on his cheeks, praying in whispered German. Frank killed him quickly. Professionally, without ceremony. 16 down. 3 to go. The final 3 Germans were running together now, having found each other in the darkness. They were exhausted, terrified, staying together for comfort that wouldn't save them. Frank caught them in an open meadow 200 yards from German lines. They heard him coming and turned to fight. 3 rifles raised, 3 fingers on triggers. Frank threw his knife. It caught the center scout in the throat. The German went down choking. 17 down. 2 to go. The remaining Germans fired simultaneously. 1 bullet grazed Frank's left shoulder, tearing through fabric and skin. Pain exploded through his arm. Frank didn't slow down. He closed the distance and killed them both with his second knife. 2 quick strikes, efficient and brutal. The first German took the blade through the eye. The second caught it in the carotid artery. They fell together into the snow, their blood mixing, steaming in the frozen air. 19 down, none to go. Frank stood alone in the meadow, surrounded by bodies, his hands black with dried blood. His shoulder throbbed. His lungs burned. His uniform was soaked with German blood. He'd been fighting for 4 hours and 17 minutes. He'd killed 19 men with his hands. Frank walked back to the listening post at Echo 7. Sullivan and the patrol were exactly where he'd left them, rifles trained on the forest, faces pale with shock. "Jesus Christ," Sullivan whispered. "We heard shooting. We thought you were dead." Frank sat down against a tree and pulled a cigarette from a dead German lieutenant's pocket. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally wearing off. "Count them in the morning," Frank said quietly. 19 bodies, northeast sector. Sullivan stared at him in disbelief. "You killed 19 Germans? Alone?" Frank lit the cigarette and took a long drag. He thought about Klaus Becker. "You see death as a technical problem." "Yeah," Frank said. "I killed 19 Germans." He smoked in silence while the winter sun rose over the Eifel Mountains, painting the frozen battlefield gold and red. Dawn broke over Echo 7 at 6:23 a.m. Captain Mitchell arrived with a full platoon, expecting casualties. Instead, he found Frank Novak sitting against a tree, smoking, his uniform stiff with frozen blood. "Where's your patrol?" Mitchell asked. "Safe. 50 yards back." "Where are the Germans?" Frank pointed northeast. "Scattered across 300 yards, 19 bodies." Mitchell stared at him. 19? You engaged 19 Germans without radio support?" "Yes, sir." "That's a direct violation of standing orders, Sergeant." Frank crushed out his cigarette. "Yes, sir." "It is."
They found the bodies at 7:15 a.m. 19 German scouts, exactly as Frank described.
Battalion intelligence confirmed it. An entire Wehrmacht reconnaissance team, eliminated in a single night by 1 American soldier using knives and a sharpened shovel. The court-martial convened 4 days later. The charges were simple: willful disobedience of direct orders, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, failure to maintain radio protocol. The prosecution argued Frank had endangered his patrol, violated doctrine, and operated outside command authority. "War requires discipline," the prosecuting officer said. "Private Novak decided he knew better than his commanding officers. That cannot stand." Sergeant Hutchins testified for the defense. "Those radios were killing us," Hutchins said flatly. 38% casualty rate in 2 weeks. Every time we called for support, the Germans triangulated our position and hit us with mortars. Novak saved lives by breaking the rules. The tribunal deliberated for 17 minutes. Verdict: guilty of disobeying orders. Sentence: formal reprimand, no reduction in rank, return to active duty. The presiding officer looked directly at Frank. You violated protocol. But you also proved that protocol was flawed. Battalion is revising engagement doctrine for forward patrols. Silent contact protocols are now authorized for small reconnaissance teams. Frank's approach became standard procedure. Radio silence during initial contact. Silent elimination when possible. Support calls only for forces exceeding squad capacity. American patrol casualties dropped to 9% within 3 weeks.
Frank Novak returned to Chicago in November 1945.
He went back to the stockyards at Swift & Company, back to the killing floor where it all started. Klaus Becker was still there, older now, hands shaking from arthritis. I heard stories, Klaus said. 19 men in one night. They said you were like a ghost. Frank sharpened his knife on the leather strop, the familiar motion calming. I just did what you taught me. See death as a technical problem. Klaus shook his head slowly. I taught you to cut meat, boy, not men. Turned out, it wasn't that different. Frank worked the stockyards for 33 more years. He never talked about the war, never attended veteran reunions, never told anyone outside his immediate family what happened that night in the Eifel Mountains. He died in 1982, age 57, of a heart attack on the killing floor at Swift & Company. His military records were declassified in 1997. A historian, researching Wehrmacht casualties in the Ardennes, found the German after-action reports. 19 scouts lost in a single night, February 18, 1945. Cause of death listed as unknown close-quarters assault.
The German commander had written, "This was not combat.
This was slaughter." Today, U.S. Army Rangers train in close-quarters battle at Fort Benning. The doctrine Frank Novak pioneered, silent approach, rapid elimination, minimal support, is now standard special operations procedure. They don't know his name. The manual doesn't credit him. But every Ranger who learns to move through darkness without sound, to kill efficiently before the enemy knows they're there, is following the path Frank Novak walked that frozen night in Germany. A butcher from Chicago's South Side who proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one the Army issues you. It's the one you've been training with your whole life.